right, good morning. We're back with another session of our listing mastery discussions and role-playing. Today we're going to focus on that important conversation with sellers as it pertains to setting expectations about, as you've heard referred to from Stephanie and others, fantasy land versus reality. And one of the challenges is sometimes sellers have a misset expectation on pricing. So what I'm going to talk about today, you have to sort of put yourself in the mindset if you're listening to this as a recording, is a discussion about pricing as it pertains to going through an MLS sheet and explaining to them in such a manner that they get what the pricing should be because you're engaging them in the conversation. So I want to contrast that with a conversation with a seller where you're just simply reciting data. In other words, I'll go through what you don't want to do first, and then you can compare it to what you do want to do. So in other words, if I've got an MLS sheet, and I was talking to Jason, I would say, you know, Jason, here's 123 Main Street. It's $300,000. It's a 3-bedroom, 2-bath. It's in the same subdivision as your property, and it's been on the market for 35 days. And Jason could either be ignoring me, he could be thinking about his golf game he's going to. He's just not engaged in the conversation. So that's what we don't want to do. And so what we're going to talk about today is setting a little bit of expectations in the context of a listing presentation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, Jason, before we get started in going through pricing, we want to make sure that we're in the right spot and we sell. I just had a couple questions I want to run through, and these won't sound different than what we've talked about before. But again, Jason, when we talked the other day on the phone, do you absolutely have to sell your home at this point?
Well, we don't absolutely have to sell, but you know, we definitely want to get something a little bit bigger. So,
okay, so you are looking for something bigger, and you know, from a standpoint of absolutely having to sell, let me ask you this: will you price your home to sell, or are you okay living on the market for a really long time?
Well, we'd like to have it sell pretty quickly.
Okay, so you would like to have it sell pretty quickly versus staying on the market for a long time. Fantastic.
Sure.
Well, Jason, I'm going to run through a couple of different MLS sheets with you here, and our whole purpose today is to make sure we end up in the reality of what's going on in the market. And what I mean by reality versus what some agents talk about as fantasy land is there's a set of properties that we're going to go through today, and you're going to see very clearly there's people that are on the market and just staying on the market, and that's sort of, they're active but not sold. And then there's the reality of what has sold, and these are properties that have gone under contract that we'll see have sold for specific prices. And what I want you to be paying attention today to is the reality of what's selling versus some of the stuff that I'll call fantasy land. I mean, it's what sellers wish they could get for properties versus the reality of what's actually selling. So if you look, Jason, at the first MLS sheet I have here, it's a property that's for sale in the neighborhood. So when you look down at the bottom, you can see that this property is at 123 Main Street. How many bedrooms and baths does this property have?
It has 3 bedrooms and 2 baths.
And that is fairly comparable to your house, isn't it?
Yeah, that's exactly what we have, actually.
Okay, and then right below that is the square footage. How many square feet does this house have?
It has 1,800.
1,800. And this property, if you look in the lower right-hand corner, it's been on the market for how many days?
52.
52 days. So it's been on the market. It's very similar square footage and bedrooms. And right next to that, in the lower right-hand corner where the days on market is the original list price that went on at. What's the price noted down there?
It's $325.
So it's at $325, and in the upper right-hand corner is the current price. And you can see that that price is exactly the same. So over the last 52 days, this property's been on the market, and it's very similar to yours. And so we've got a price point here of $325,000. And as you'll note, and I'm going to get out of role play here for a second. So Jason and I would go do the same exercise with about 3 of these actives. So now we've got some expectation we can go back to. So if I need to refer back to one of these, Jason's already committed that this property's been out there for 52 days, and it's at $325,000. It's very similar to his. So now, Jason, I've got another property here. Now we're going to get into the more important things, properties that have actually sold. Remember we talked about fantasy land versus reality. So the property here that we've got at Alias Court, it's 3475. This is, again, across the subdivision. It's not about a block and a half away. And you'll note that when you look at it, how many bedrooms and baths are in this house?
This one also has 3 bedrooms and 2 baths.
And the square footage?
It's 1,900.
Okay, so we got another one that you described earlier on the actives. This would be very similar to yours, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I would say so.
Okay, now let's look in the lower right-hand corner again. This one was on the market. You'll see there, instead of the days active, it's actually got the number of days it was on the market before it went in contract in the lower right-hand corner. How many days was it on the market?
7 days.
So it was on for only 7 days. And if you remember, the actives we looked at were 50 and 65 days, and they're still active. And they were in that 325, 340 range. What is the price that this property sold for, Jason?
$288,000.
Okay. So as you remember, the actives were around the 325, 335 range. This is 285. And so when you look at that, what do you think that tells you about the price range around 285 versus the 325 range?
Well, it means that that house sold for 285, and the ones that are on the market obviously are more expensive and haven't been selling.
Well, you know, and this is one data point. We're going to look at 2 more right after this, but that's something that we need to start paying attention to, because when we talk about fantasy land versus reality, we've got to compare and contrast what sellers wish they could get and what buyers are willing to pay. Because I think you would agree, and we've talked about this before, it doesn't matter how much you and I want to try and promote your property for, it's what buyers are really paying. And this is an example, the first of 3, that we're going to look at about what a buyer is willing to pay, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to go through 2 more of these, Jason, with you. Same exercise. If one is slightly bigger or one's got an extra bedroom, we'll just note that. And at the end of it, I'm going to come back into role play now. So Jason, based on these 3 properties that have sold, that with one exception where one has an extra half bath, they're all very similar, and they've sold at price ranges that are 275, 280, and one was 288. What price do you believe you need to set in order for your property to be the next one that a buyer will pick and actually make an offer on?
Well, we'd really like to get 300 for it.
Okay. Well, and I understand that. I mean, I want to get you, and we're on the same page here, I want to get you as much money as possible. That's my job, to get you as much as possible. But if we look at what buyers are willing to pay, and if we look at these 3 properties, I'll lay them out side by side here, which one of these 3 would indicate that we could get $300,000 for your property?
Yeah, I guess I see what you're saying.
So what price do you think that we need to set in order to have it be sold and you can actually get into the next bigger property you want to buy?
Well, can we start at 290 and lower the price if nobody buys it?
Well, we certainly could do that. And I guess the question for you would be, we're just turning the corner into October. And when we look at the market, expectation is if we make it into the holidays, it's going to probably slow down just because the weather gets a little bit colder. Do you want to sell in the next 30 days, or do you want to run the risk that you'd be like those actives we looked at that might take 50, 60, 75 days to sell?
Well, you know, we would like to sell it fairly quickly. What price would you recommend?
Well, I guess, Jason, let's look at this. We've got these 3 properties in front of us, and one sold in 7 days, another one sold in 12, and then the other one sold in 14 days. So certainly all of them sold and went under contract in less. They didn't close that quickly, obviously, but they went under contract in less than 2 weeks, or right at 2 weeks. So if we look at those, and we have a price range of 288 at the high and 275 at the low, do you think that if we wanted to sell in the next 2 weeks, we can go any higher than, say, 285, 288?
Probably not, no.
Okay, so let's do the right thing, and given the seasonality of the real estate business, I would recommend a price of 280 for your house. And let's stick to that price and just go into contract in the first week. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I suppose it does.
Okay. Any questions about that in terms of kind of walking through pricing by either of you guys? I know there's a couple of you on here.
Well, you know, I understand what you're doing there, and this works well if you're in a subdivision or a condo with very similar properties, but how do you handle it when you've got, like in a lot of my areas, it's a multitude of different entities. So there's a lot of factors that could go into pricing besides square footage, bedrooms, and bathrooms.
Well, I'm going to look at, and that's a great question, Scott, because if you look back at when I sold in St. Louis, we talked about in the previous 2 weeks that it's a very heterogeneous market, meaning you could have a house that's newer next to one that's very old, one that's restored, one that's 180,000, next one right next door to it, 600,000. This is where previewing and picking the correct evidence, if you will, is going to help you. Buyers don't go out and say, and this is what you have to explain to sellers. Buyers don't come into the market and say, I want to look at one house at 300,000 and one at 700,000 and then the other one at 450. So even though on a given street or a small, fairly good area, that's all that's there, what they're going to do is they're going to go out and say, I've got a budget of 500,000 or 600,000 or whatever their price range is. And it's up to you to pick the correct ones because that's what buyers do. They're going to run through, look at 5, 10, 20 properties, depending on what kind of agent they're working with, and they're going to actually see properties in similar price ranges. So it's up to you to pick the right one and help them compare and contrast. So Scott, I'll jump into role play with you and I'll go through this. And, so Scott, I've got 3 active properties here. Let's go through the first one, and you'll see that it's also a century home. It's approximately 110 years old and it's been updated. So when you look at the description here, and we run through the information, you see that I've highlighted in the description 3 things. And Scott, I'm going to come out of role play because you're not going to be able to see this. You'll note there, and what you would have noted is, you've highlighted that it has granite countertops. It's got about $100,000 in the kitchen, or whatever the similar upgrades were. And I would say after you read that, so Scott, tell me, does that sound like if buyers were looking at properties, that property is going to be very similar from a standpoint of updates to yours?
Well, it sounds similar, but sometimes you get, I've seen online, like I go to Zillow or Redfin and see the closed sales, and, although they may have upgrades, they could be, poorly done, or, some of these places will have, our place is all hardwood floors. I don't know what flooring this place has. So it's hard to know exactly what I'm comparing it to by just looking at this data.
Sure. Well, and I can certainly tell you, Scott, if you're struggling with that, I'd be happy to take you through it. And we're going to actually get into properties that have sold. And you'll note on the second line of the description there that this property has Brazilian cherry wood, and it's a very, very upgraded flooring, very similar to yours, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So, again, if you're struggling with this at the end of this, Scott, we can go out and look at a couple of these properties just like a buyer would, and so you can very quickly figure out whether or not you think they're comparable or not. I've been through every one of these properties, and I selected them because if you were a buyer today and came to me, I would take you out and show you these 3 properties because they would be somewhat similar, and you could pick the one that you thought was the best. Mm-hmm. And I would do the same thing, Scott, with the solds. Now, we can't go in and look at those, but I'm going to have to very carefully pick what I want you. Remember, it's kind of like walking somebody through a deposition or a cross-examination. The seller, because they can't get into the solds, has to be able to clearly understand from what you've either highlighted or you asked them to look at on the comparable, what is comparable and what's not comparable. So in other words,
so don't even bother with pictures or anything else. We're just going straight from the data, and we're kind of controlling the process because we're only showing them things that we want them to see.
Well, and that's not saying don't show them pictures. If there's something illustrative about the interior of a property and it's a sold, you may ask them to flip to the second page, in which case I would say, Scott, can you please turn to the page that has all the color pictures of the interior of this house? Now, based on looking at that and us walking around your house today, do you think that this looks comparable to yours or not as comparable? And I realize that being there in person versus pictures would be preferable, but we can't because the property is already sold. But just based on the color pictures that I've got, the enlarged versions, or what I would typically do, would you think that that was somewhat comparable to your property, or inferior or superior? And you would typically, I've rarely had a seller not say, yeah, that looks very similar to mine. That picture of that kitchen looks very similar to mine. And if you don't do this, you run the risk that they're going to be off in fantasy land, and they're going to be going through the process of subjectively trying to think why their house is worth more money. And this is why, if you pick the correct set of actives and then pendings and solds, and I don't show too many different things, it's pretty easy for them to see. And as you saw when I did this with Jason, it's difficult for him to come back. If I just simply said to him, I didn't argue with him. I just said, if you remember, just like I would do to you, Scott, I'd say, Scott, I know you want $650,000. Again, let's look at 3 of these that have sold, and they've all sold between $575,000 and $600,000. Can you tell me what causes you to believe that your property would sell for more? Let's go back through these again. And pretty quickly, you're going to have to make an argument that's fantasy land. I don't know what you're going to come up with.
Right.
And if it's something that is an unanswered question, remember, we have to very carefully separate out people that just emotionally want more money from those that are in fantasy land, because there's an unanswered question. Like you said, Scott, you very well may have a perception that your kitchen is more upgraded, or this house isn't comparable because you think it has less superior improvements of some kind, in which case we're going to have to refer to the pictures. Or we're going to have to, if it's an active, say, let's go look at that active.
Right. So before I even get to the appointment, I've got to qualify these people to make sure that I've got a candidate where, although they believe their house is worth something, I guess it's all about assessing their motivation before I get in there to determine if they're really a good candidate. I'll give you an example. I just had a lead come in for a $900,000 house. It's a builder. He has renters in there. Actually, renters are just are not paying their rent right now, and so he's thinking of putting it back on the market. $900,000 in Elmhurst. And when I was talking to him, he's like, yeah, I don't have to sell. I want to sell. I want to be able to cash out. But the fact is that he's got offers $100,000 less. And when I look at the comps quickly, I'm seeing that that's probably where the place would sell for. And I guess my question, I asked him, do you want, do you have other properties? Are you actually, that you manage? And he said, yes, to this question. And do you have to sell? No, I don't have to sell. So at that point, it sounds like an unmotivated seller I should probably walk from. At the same time, I'm not sure if it's just him saying that, or if I'm not asking the questions correctly, or I should try to get in there, walk him through it, and just kind of verify it, because it's such a big opportunity. Verify the guy's just out of his mind.
Well, especially for a builder, Scott, that has potentially multiple properties, you probably want to err on the side of, depending on how busy you are, get out and meet them at the house, preview the house, discuss what's going on in the market, because it could be positioning. You got to remember, a builder, especially of higher-end properties, is going to be fairly sophisticated. Mm-hmm. My experience is I've had plenty of them tell me up front, I don't really want to do this, but they also don't like the headache of people that are in there that, they have to recarpet, repaint, and fix things again and again, and especially if they start not getting rent, that could be the ultimate motivation. Now, you can do the same exercise. I mean, if you prove that you really understand the market and you're going through sales comparables, even if he doesn't bite on it, you're demonstrating that you're different than your competition, which is you're sharp enough to realize what's really going on in the market. And when you get to that point where you ask the builder, based on these 3 or 4 sales comparables, what price do you need to set in order for your property to be the next property to sell to a buyer? And he comes up with something much higher to say, well, I guess I may have missed something when I explained this to you. What are you seeing in these 3 comparables that would allow us to price at $950 when all 3 of these are indicating that properties are selling for $850 that are comparable? And let him try and sell you. And he may self-discover that he is not motivated, or he may self-discover that the market's not going to bear that. But then you can also ask him some questions, especially for more sophisticated sellers. So, Scott, tell me a little bit about your fear about what's going to happen with interest rates when, not if, but when the Federal Reserve rolls off of its massive purchases. And the expectations are that interest rates are going to change dramatically. What is your thought on that? He'll know. He'll see if he's a sophisticated seller or a builder. And the answer is, he's going to tell you is, rates are going to potentially go up by quite a bit. In which case you can ask a follow-on question, and you can say, well, let's say that you do keep the property. The Federal Reserve does taper off the purchases of these mortgage-backed securities, and rates go up by a point and a half, which is possible. What do you feel that's going to do to the purchasing power of buyers for your property? And what's he going to tell you?
Oh, it's going to hurt.
Okay, so assuming that the cost of buying things goes up dramatically, is that going to make the market stronger or weaker for the product?
Yeah, to make it weaker.
Okay, so based on all of that, the fact that you have to re-tenant the property, evict the people that are in there, what I mean by re-tenanting, you got legal expenses, painting, carpet, and all that, and you may be able to sell it for less if interest rates go up a year from now. Wouldn't it make more sense for you to put it on at the right price, sell it, and take that risk off the table for you and go make more money by putting your capital into the next project?
Yeah, absolutely.
He doesn't make money owning the property as a landlord at the same level that he can when he does the building process. Builders make money when they run through the process of building properties. It's a different thing than a landlord that's an investor. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Okay. Any other questions? I know, Karen, you're on here as well. Did you have any questions about this? Because I know you jumped in the middle of when we were running through talking about.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was late coming back from my B&I group this morning. I just wanted to just really catch whatever you had to say, Kevin, because I was just trying to take notes and just you know, listen and grow.
Okay. Well, did you have any questions about the goal of what we're doing here? And I'll kind of recap it just so that as we wrap up here today, we can understand what the goal is. The goal is to present a set of evidence. In other words, not too many comparables, not too few. And if you're in a market like you are, Karen, where you might be over in Webster Groves, or Scott is in Chicagoland, where they're all heterogeneous properties. And all markets either have a lot of this or some of this. But you have to pick the correct ones that are either going to be the way buyers are going to look at the market, or they're just the best comparables for actives and solds. And I generally won't present more than 3 or 4 of each. Now, I may have a couple of pending in addition to the solds. If you have too many things, in other words, if it's here's the encyclopedia of everything that's going on in the market, there's 12 actives, and there's, you know, here's 56 sells, you're going to lose them. Can't get somebody to engage and ask those questions. So that's what we certainly have seen to work the best, is to limit it, because it generally won't take more than 3 or 4 pending and sold comparables for a seller to get what they should set as a price on their property. Or you didn't pick the correct ones, and that's the harsh reality. If you pick real poor comparables, either for actives or solds, or pending and solds, you're going to have a difficult time proving the value. And even if it's a heterogeneous market, like in where you are, Karen, in like Webster Groves or certain areas, you can look at it in the eyes of a buyer as like, what would buyers, if they were looking for a $350,000 or $500,000 property, want to go look at? Okay, now if I'm looking at those as the actives, what are the solds that are most comparable to this seller's property, even if I've got to do some adjusting? And you're going to have to pick the right ones, or you're going to have a difficult time, because then it becomes 100% subjective. And while buyers apply some subjectivity to the process, they don't tell you, I'll either look at a $300,000 house or I'll do $650,000. They're in a price range, and within that price range, they're going to pick the best value that meets their general criteria. I mean, if they have 2 houses that are both $450,000 and one completely up, and it's got a $100,000 kitchen in it, and the other one doesn't, it's pretty easy for that seller to go, oh, I can see why that sold, and the other one's still on the market after 100 days.
Right.
But only if you ask them the right questions, if you highlight in the description. And this is why you'll have a much more difficult time, and it has to do with a little bit with technology. People glaze over when they're looking at an iPad screen. People will glaze over if they're just looking at a fancy presentation. But if you get them to engage in a highlighted sheet out of the MLS, it's difficult for them to be running their own agenda, especially when you start asking them questions and asking them to point out things and asking them their opinion. It makes them engaged in the process. It has them make their opinion known, and you know whether you have a big objection or not. So that's why we do what we do. And it wasn't like I dreamt this up. This was something that I was taught by my coach. And it was something that people have been doing all over the country for a long, long time. But when I shifted to this, it was like a night and day difference on pricing objections. If you ended up out at a unmotivated seller, it was pretty quick for them to be able to say, oh, I don't care what these comps say. And you just knew that I did a better job of fault. But somebody who's motivated is going to very quickly do what Jason did at the beginning of the call and say, yeah, I guess, 325 is not realistic. You think I can get 290? I was just walking him down the price range, and we already knew, even if I had to end up in that role play, if you go back and listen to this again, at 290, I suggested 280. Let's get it sold in the first week and just stick hard to our price. And even if Jason fought me on that and said, I tell you what, I'm not willing to go under 290, I was still at a lot better price point than what he had suggested originally, which was 325, 335. So always lead yourself to the right price, even if you're going to get back a little bit. So in other words, let me just finish this point, Karen. I don't know if you want to have a question. In Jason's case, if you go back and listen to that again, I suggested 280 and didn't agree to his 290 because I want him to feel like at the end he could win, and I was willing to even take the 290 if he held me to it again. Don't go in and suggest your best, highest price that you'd be willing to accept, because then the seller feels like they lose if you stick hard to that price.
Right. Do you suggest I do this?
Go ahead.
Do you suggest I do the same thing, like when I've gotten a big price reduction and I'm getting ready to receive a contract? Like I lowered my $1,795,000 listing, and we lowered it to $1,005,000. I took her out and showed her 8 active properties that were comps, and we lowered the prices last week, and then we got a showing over the weekend right away. And now I'm supposed to be getting a contract. Do I do the same thing when I get ready to present the offer? Should I just pull up the solds and pull up what has sold and what the amenities are, so that they have something to sort of compare with this? I don't know where this contract's going to come in at. I don't know if it's going to be real close to the $1,005,000 or if it's going to be closer to $1,003,000 or $1,004,000. I just don't have any clues. So do you suggest I do the same thing when I'm getting ready to receive an offer from somebody, that I pull up the solds so that I can show them the comps on the solds again?
Yeah, I mean, depending on how long you've been on the market, obviously updates to sellers are important, and also updates when you do get an offer are important, especially if it's not the first week, a week or two. So Karen, I would pull 3 or 4 most appropriate, especially since you've been on the market, if there's anything new that's sold. But I would also, if you do, just to answer your question, if you think $1,005,000 is a good defendable price and the agent comes in at $1,003,000, you should ask that agent, and I would just simply say to you, Karen, I want to get you to the finish line. I know my sellers are going to ask a question about the price that you've offered. Do you have a couple of comparables you can include with your offer that would help me sell your price to my seller?
Okay.
And so now if the agent says, well, no, or God knows what they're going to say if they're just lowballing, and it helps them think like you're not a jerky listing agent, and you're giving them an out or a way to do this, and you're basically calling them out, but in a soft way. Because now I can work with you, Karen, and say, well, I think you and I both can agree that we need to get a set of comparables if I'm going to get my seller to sign off on an offer. I'm just trying to figure out the right information for you and I to put in front of the seller. And if they can't do it, you can say, I'll tell you what, I'm happy to go over, I'm going to present it tonight. Let me show you what I have. And then you send it over to that buyer agent, even in advance of a counteroffer, so that they're aware of it. You don't say that your price is ridiculous, you're a jerk, like some of those.
Oh, no.
But, people are out there doing that. Hey, do you know who I am, and how dare you write it at $1,003,000 kind of thing. I know you.
I'm not that kind of an agent.
People are out there that do that. So you could get the same attitude from a buyer agent, and this is just a better way to come across like you're trying to help them win. But at the same time, if they can't send you great comparables, you can then say that, well, I'm not going to do that or whatever. You just don't react to that. You can just simply shoot them the 3 things that you're going to show to your seller to say, you know, this is what I see in the market. Let me know if you've got anything different for me to basically share with my seller, and then run those as the 3 comparables you go through when you're presenting your offer.
Great. Okay. Thank you. That'll help.
Okay. Good. Well, I think we got through a lot today. We can continue on with some of these discussions next week if you want. I'm going to wrap this up because I've got to run off to a meeting. Does anybody else have anything real quick before we drop off today? Okay, good. All right, thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week.
Thanks, Kevin.
Thanks,
All right,
Kevin.
you're welcome.